Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altmann, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Jim Walsh, an expert in international security and a research associate with the Security Studies program at MIT. Dr. Walsh's research and writing focus on topics involving weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. Dr. Walsh has testified before the U.S. Senate on the issue of nuclear terrorism and chaired the Harvard University International Working Group on Radiological Terrorism. Among his current projects are two series of dialogues on nuclear issues, one with representatives from North Korea and the other with leading figures in Iran. He has traveled to both countries and has testified before the Senate on Iran's nuclear program. The title of his October 20th public lecture on campus is Obama versus McCain, Which Way for U.S. Foreign Policy? Hint, it's not what you think. Welcome, Jim. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
I have to follow up on your lecture title first. It's intriguing, especially with a hint. How do you think U.S. foreign policy will evolve after the election?
Well, obviously it depends on who is elected. We have two leaders who, two candidates who, while they share some policy views, also have important differences. But it's not necessarily what you think because they don't walk in with a blank slate. They're going to have constraints, not the least of which is the financial crisis and two wars. And they will have a Congress to deal with. All presidents, even if the party is the same, if both the Congress and the presidency are Republican, or if they're both Democratic, there's still fights between the executive and the legislative branches. So this new president coming in will try to pursue his own goals, but he'll find that he's working within constraints over which he has little control.
Okay, and we won't go any further than that in speculating. Much of your work is focused on Iran. Why are relations so strained between the United States and Iran?
It's a good question, Barbara. Iran and the U.S., it is a unpleasant, long history of legitimate mutual grievance. And each one of those words is important, legitimate and mutual grievance. We have complaints about Iran. The revolution, the hostage taking, concerns and questions about their nuclear program. And they have grievances and concerns about us, whether it was in 1953 when we worked with the British to stage a coup to topple their leader, the Iran-Iraq War when we backed Saddam over them, even though Saddam was using chemical weapons against that country, against Iran. And on and on it goes. And so you have two countries that do not have diplomatic relations, so we're not talking to each other. You have a history of suspicion and mistrust. And both sides think the other side is trying to play them. So when I go to Iran, I'm going to Iran at the end of this week, going back to Iran, when I talk to my Iranian colleagues, they say, oh, this nuclear issue, it's not serious, it's a pretext. You're using it because really what you want is regime change. You want to control us. And if it wasn't the nuclear issue, it'd be something else. You just move the goalposts and you guys would be castling us about something else. And the Americans say, along the same lines, when Iran says our nuclear program is intended for peaceful purposes only, the U.S. says, no, wait a minute, you weren't forthcoming in telling us about your activities, you were concealing them, your story has changed several times, you're not abiding by various Security Council resolutions. And while the Iranians think that they have legitimate answers for those, nevertheless, there's enough gray in between that both sides can feel especially mistrust towards the other. And in that environment of mistrust, in the absence of any formal dialogue between governments, then it's very hard to make progress.
So we're dealing with 50 years, more than 50 years of accumulated mistrust, and it's often not about the actual issue in hand, you're saying?
Oh, absolutely. And it continues. I think the new president coming in, there's going to be a desire to maybe make a bold move on Iran one way or another by the new president. But many of my colleagues and I wonder if that's the right course, because Iran, when it was sitting in Tehran and looking over at the United States, you don't see much difference between Republicans and Democrats. Right? Democratic-controlled House and Senate right now, they pass sanctions resolutions against Iran. They watch the presidential debates. Both candidates say unpleasant things about Iran from an Iranian perspective. So they're going to be they're going to approach whoever it is with caution, and they're going to want to wait and see and learn more about this new person in office before they make any commitment. I think there's a sense in the U.S. that simply by changing the person in the office, that suddenly, everything will be wine and roses, and the Iranians will start agreeing with us, and there aren't really differences that can't be solved just by switching the person in office. I think a change in administration, regardless of who it is, will help. It creates the possibility of starting with a new slate without all the baggage from before. But, it's like some personal relationships. You can't rush into them right away, especially if there's a bad history. And so I think it's going to take a little time, regardless of what our intentions are. It's going to take a little time for the Iranians to feel like we're going to be someone they can deal with. And frankly, a new administration coming in, they're going to feel the same way. They're going to be trying to get their people into the various positions and getting their feet, and it's going to take them a while to get settled as well.
That's a very useful corrective to remind us that things do not look quite the same from the other side of the conversation, and that the change, whatever the change will be, isn't quite as dramatic as we assume it will be, I suppose. But speaking of sanctions, can we go back to that for a moment?
Sure.
Have sanctions had any effect? How has Iran responded?
Well, it's a good question, because sanctions are the core of the U.S. policy towards Iran. We've had sanctions since the revolution in 1979. The Europeans have had more economic and other exchange with Iran, but we have tried to wash our hands of any dealings with them. We haven't been completely successful, but that's what we've tried to do. Now, the effect of those sanctions. Prior to the recent sanctions, the international sanctions out of the UN, those were coming in 2003. Prior to that, what little academic evidence we have, what little scholarly evidence we have, suggests that the sanctions have some effect, but the effect is modest. Now, remember, they're a big economy. Like any medium power, they're a big economy. And there are lots of things that determine how well your economy does. And in this case, their economy is mostly oil. So if the price of oil increases, they're going to do better. Now, sanctions do add cost. They add cost at the margin. They add to inflation. They make things more difficult, more inconvenient for Iran. But they're not the most important variable in the economy. I think most economists looking at Iran would say it's their own mismanagement of the economy, in particular President Ahmadinejad, pumping too much money into the system that has caused inflation. So they've sort of done the worst to themselves. We've added to it a little bit with these international sanctions, but I think the sanctions are at least as much a psychological cost as they are an economic cost. In other words, the Iranians take this as still, they're a very proud people, and they feel like they've been encircled and attacked, and they deserve more respect than they get, that they're the Rodney Dangerfield of Southwest Asia. And so when they're sanctioned, that sends them the message that they're still being isolated, and I think that has an impact. So do they do something? Yes. Is it as big an impact as we would like to think that it has? No. At the end of the day, it's the Iranian economy turns on things that we have little control over.
In what capacity will you be going to Iran on your upcoming trip?
Well, this is, I guess, my fourth or fifth trip to Iran, and in each and every case, I've been invited either by the Foreign Ministry or by the Expediency Council or by a private think tank to come and participate in a conference. And while most tourists, Americans can visit Iran as tourists with tour programs, most academics can't simply show up in the country. You have to get a visa, and they can be stingy with the visas. So the conference provides the mechanism, the platform that allows me to go, and I will give a paper at this conference, but it'll also be an opportunity for me to catch up with colleagues and to exchange information and to talk about what's happening on both sides, in both countries.
You were there relatively recently as well, I believe, right? 2000 and...
Yeah, I was there earlier this year. I think I was there in March of this year. I was supposed to go in June, but didn't get the visa. The visa is a great game. You can never predict whether you're going to get the visa or not. You'd think that if the Foreign Ministry invited you, since the Foreign Ministry issues the visas, that you'd be able to go. But it doesn't quite work that way.
Not that easy.
No.
Okay. So the bottom line question, how close is Iran to having a usable nuclear weapon?
Well, that's what everyone's concerned about. My own inclination is to follow the National Intelligence Estimate that was released at the end of last year. And what that estimate says is that Iran is making progress in its enrichment program, but it will be some number of years before they produce enough material that would enable them to have a nuclear weapons capability. And I think the important thing for viewers to keep in mind here is we're really talking about a continuum or a ladder. You don't go and have a bomb right away. The most important thing to build in building a nuclear weapon is having fissile material, either highly enriched uranium or plutonium. Now, what Iran has is a enrichment program. That enrichment program currently produces low enriched uranium. You cannot make a nuclear weapon with low enriched uranium. But unfortunately, the same technology that allows you to enrich uranium a little bit is the same technology that allows you to enrich uranium a lot. And so the concern is that if their program reaches some threshold, that they would be in a position to enrich enough uranium that they would be able to build a bomb. But that is some point in the distance. It's not tomorrow, it's not next month, it's not next year. Probably sometime over the next president's term, the issue of a nuclear weapons capability, will they have enough centrifuges to make enough uranium if they chose to, a highly enriched uranium to make a bomb, will become a live issue. But then, you know, they would have to pull out of the international safeguard system. That would cause a ruckus. They'd have to take this material and turn it into a bomb. That would take time. All these things take time, but it's an issue. I like to say we need to treat this with urgency because it's creeping forward every day, but we also need to have a little patience and be sober in how we deal with it. It's not something where we have to freak out and respond tomorrow. We have time to try to put ourselves on a different track, but we don't have enough time that we can ignore it.
Speaking of that different track, in March 2008, you and some colleagues wrote a piece in the New York Review of Books, and there was a similar shorter piece in the International Herald Tribune. The title of the New York Review of Books article was "A Solution for the U.S.-Iran Nuclear Standoff."
Yes, a modest title.
A modest title. Well, we'll get back to the response that you got. But in that modest article, you outlined a possible solution to the impasse, the standoff. Could you describe what you were proposing?
Yeah, what we're trying to deal with is a basic conundrum in this nuclear issue between the positions of the two main parties. So on the one hand, you have the United States insisting there be absolutely no centrifuges, zero centrifuges on Iranian soil. And the Iranians, their minimum position is we have to have enrichment on Iranian soil.
May I just make sure we get the technical piece in here? The enriching is what depends on the centrifuges, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so you need centrifuges to enrich the uranium.
Raw material and turn it into low enriched uranium. So the centrifuges are the thing. That's it's not the nuclear power plant, it's not Bushehr, it's not how many nuclear scientists they have. The sensitive technology here is centrifuges. Lots of countries have nuclear power programs but don't make nuclear weapons or don't have a nuclear weapons capability. The difference is centrifuges and reprocessing, but centrifuges allow you to make fuel that not only can be used for power plants, but that can be used for nuclear weapons.
Okay.
So the U.S. says no centrifuges. They say it's our right, and we absolutely insist that we have centrifuges operating on Iranian soil. And what we tried to do is cut through that knot by saying, let's take Iran's current nationally owned centrifuge program and multilateralize it or multinationalize it. In other words, we'll transfer the ownership, management, and operation of that facility from Iran itself, only Iran, only the Iranian government, and we'll put that into a system where it's managed and operated by an international group, of which Iran is a member. So you get enrichment on Iranian soil, but it's not owned only by the Iranians. And so we say, let a group of countries or an international agency run that facility on Iranian territory with the proviso that we improve the safeguards, that we upgrade the transparency. And so what we would have is a situation where you would have international staff on the ground, 24/7, eyes and ears, knowing all the people who work at the plant. That would be a better outcome to do that than what we have right now, which is simply Iran operating under sort of standard rules, which really aren't as stringent or aren't as transparent as the system that we propose.
Do I remember correctly that you call this a reasonable second best solution?
Exactly. I think what we have here, at least as far as U.S. policies, a situation in which the great is the enemy of the good. Now, do I want Iran to have centrifuges? No, I don't. I don't think most non-proliferation advocates want it. But I don't want anyone to have centrifuges, frankly. I mean, I think that we should be moving away from a model in which every country has a technology that can bring them closer to the bomb. We should be internationalizing that and getting out of this national model. So I don't want to see national centrifuges. But by insisting on zero, we're going to be in a situation where they eventually build tens of thousands of centrifuges under their own national control. No one can stop it, and there'll be very little transparency. So that's why, rather than saying zero and ending up with the worst possible situation, what we're trying to do is have a middle path that says, let's get something that satisfies both parties. The pride of Iran, a proud nation, so that it can claim that it has enrichment on its soil, but a sufficient assurance for the West that we can be confident that that technology and that knowledge is not being used for military purposes.
And could you just explain to me one more time the incentive for the Iranians to accept that kind of a multinational solution?
It's a good question. And, well, I can say by way of background, the Iranians have floated proposals for multinationalization in the past. Now, of course, it's unfortunately one of these things where it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder. I'm sure their plan for multinationalization maybe isn't as robust as our plan for multinationalization or multilateralization, but they have repeatedly expressed openness to this concept. And in my discussions with Iranian officials, they've consistently done so. Why? This is your question. Why would they want to go along with that? Well, I think it allows them to achieve their objectives, which is, of course, part of what you do in a negotiation. Let all the parties achieve their objectives. It allows them to achieve their objectives and get out from under international opprobrium, get out from the sanctions, be able to bring in more investment into their oil and natural gas industries, and not insignificantly, be recognized as a normal country, a sovereign country that's respected in the international community. Again, I think the psychological component of this particular problem is not trivial. So if they could get what they want and have some of these sanctions removed and have be a full member of the international community, I think that's something they'd be interested in doing.
So there's a lot of symbolic and political capital invested in that for them.
Exactly.
In this.
And so you asked before, how hard do this, what is the impact of the sanctions? Well, the sanctions are not the most important thing in the Iranian economy, but they're enough of a hindrance, especially since they have some problems with inflation right now. They're enough of a hindrance, and the political message is sufficiently unpleasant to them that they would prefer them not be there if they could get come to a deal that would allow them to be removed, but also meet their own internal political needs.
Maybe one last question on the Iranian situation. Would the U.S. and or its allies have the will and the strength to make a military response if Iran were to choose to refuse these multilateral arrangements?
Well, it's a good question. I think right now the answer is no. We see that at the UN Security Council, where the U.S. has gotten sanctions. They've tended to be weak sanctions. And now with the recent problems with the U.S.-Russian relationship after Georgia, it's unlikely that the UN Security Council is going to authorize military action against Iran. But I think that if we were able to pursue a multinational plan, and then if Iran were to pull out of it or were to cheat or kick out the international team, that would provide enough political cause to be able to get a resolution that would support the use of force. I think meeting them halfway creates enough political support on our side that we can get our allies to go along with us if we need to do that, and I hope we don't have to go down that route. But we're more likely to get that support if we show some flexibility up front than if we continue to say no, no, 0, 0, 0. But let's face it, if the recent past is any guide, we're going to continue to have, every 6 months, there's going to be a panic here about whether we're going to attack Iran. And it's going to reverberate through Iran. Iran has presidential elections coming up in June, June 12th, and that can cut both ways. When you have threats of military attack, work themselves through a presidential election, that can be a very ugly thing. So I don't think we're going to attack Iran. I don't think there's any need to do that. We're not reaching that threshold, as we discussed before. It is some years before this reaches a point where that is even a legitimate issue, I think. But we're certainly in the near term, the Security Council isn't going to sign off on it. I don't think.
I can't resist turning to your second major area of focus, which is North Korea. Could you talk a little bit about what you think the most helpful move the U.S. government could make is with regard to diffusing the situation in North Korea?
I think the most helpful move is to stick to the darn agreement that we agreed to. You know, that would be the main thing. By way of context, we signed an agreement with the North Koreans, I guess it was February 2007. And it's a set of phases, and in the famous phrase from this, you know, actions for actions, words for words. They do something, we do something. They do something, we do something. Again, an example of a country, no diplomatic relations, lots of mistrust, very shaky situation there. But we have proceeded now through the first two phases of this, and they promised to do things, and we promised to do things. So we promised that we would stop freezing their funds that were in a certain bank, Banco Delta Asia. And we promised that, and then it took us 5 months to do it. It turned out to be more complicated than we thought. Well, so then they delayed what they were supposed to do for 5 months. But then we moved forward again. And then they were supposed to make a declaration of what they had, what they owned, you know, their nuclear belongings, as it were, and they promised to dismantle their reactor. Remember, again in this case, if they don't have a functioning reactor, they're not able to produce the type of nuclear material they need to make nuclear weapons. No reactor, no more nuclear weapons beyond what they already have. So they started to dismantle this reactor, went through the first several, 11 of the 15 steps, invited the International Atomic Energy Agency in, invited U.S. inspectors in, and we're going to that. Now, in return for that, we were supposed to take them off the Trading with the Enemies Act and the terrorism list, which seems like a pretty good deal, if you ask me. You know, we take their name off a piece of paper and they shut down their nuclear reactor. You know, I'll take that agreement every day. But no, you know, they started to go down and dismantle it, and we would not take them off the list. We said, well, there's one other thing. We want more verification. We don't feel confident about this. So what did they do? They started, they said, okay, you know, fine then. And they started to reverse what they had done on their nuclear reactor. Now, luckily, just some months ago, or not less than a month ago, when this was really at the brink of completely collapsing, as I like to say about the North Koreans and the Americans, both have an incredible capacity to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, you know. And it looked like this was going to be deja vu all over again here. But the U.S. agreed to take them off. They found a way to fudge it diplomatically. The U.S. agreed to take them off these lists. So we're back in business. So as of today, the North Koreans have begun again to dismantle their reactor and to invite outside inspectors in. So I think, again, in a context where both sides don't trust the other, both sides think the other's a cheater. The other's trying to play it. Get away with something. In that context, you need to do what you promise you're going to do. They need to do what they promised to give us confidence about them, and then we need to respond in kind. And when we don't respond in kind, that's when the thing starts to unravel. So my advice to the new administration would be continue down the path we've already started that has already bore fruit. In this case, at least capping the North Korea program by shutting down that reactor.
How do you manage to keep your sense of humor on these very, very serious issues?
You know, I get asked that question, you know, and I work mostly on nuclear issues. But my research and scholarship gives me reason to be optimistic. I mean, part of it is I'm a hardwired optimist, probably, right? I just can't help it. But if you look at the history of the nuclear age, it's really a history of success. You know, everyone thinks we're all going to die in a fiery nuclear exchange, and that nuclear weapons are spreading all around the world, and that the spread of nuclear weapons is inevitable. Well, the facts say something different. The facts say that the rate of nuclear proliferation has declined over time. There are fewer nuclear weapon states over time, that it peaked in the 60s, and that we've made great progress. all those predictions about lots of countries' nuclear weapons, nuclear wars, limited nuclear strikes, that didn't come true. It's arguably one of the most successful public policy experiences we've had in this century. And the important thing is to recognize that and to build on that success.
That's a good and very reassuring answer. I wanted to turn to a short piece of yours that I read just as we begin to wind down here. It's called Talking to Terrorists, Pretense and Posturing. And
yeah, I was sort of mad when I wrote that.
You were mad?
That's what leads to a good op-ed, is if you're sort of ticked off and you sit down and you bang that thing out in an hour.
May I take a stab at guessing why you were mad? You make reference in that piece to certain disinformation that was being circulated about your own, something you had said, I believe.
Yeah, I don't. You know, unfortunately, my memory is not my strongest attribute. I think, as I remember it, and I probably have this wrong, is that this was a case where it had a situation when I think President Bush had sort of stuck his finger in the presidential campaign and said, people who want to talk to North Koreans or talk to Iranians are appeasers, you know, the A word that is a staple of American politics. And I'm thinking to myself, let me get this straight. You're saying people who talk to Iran and North Korea are appeasers, yet you're engaged in talks with North Korea. You're engaged in, unfortunately, failed talks with Iran over the future of Iraq, the tripartite talks. You talk to the Sunni terrorists who were killing American soldiers, right? These are the sons of Iraq. You talk to them, and that's considered the biggest victory that we've had in turning around the war in Iraq, is that we negotiated with these guys, and now they're on our side rather than al-Qaeda's side. And you're saying they're appeasers? You got to be kidding me. So it was in that spirit that I wrote the op-ed.
Do you want to turn that into a piece of advice for whoever the next president is?
Well, I think I would follow the advice of the 5 former secretaries of state, 3 of which who were Republican, you know, including Kissinger and Secretary Baker, that say you have to be able to talk to your adversaries. You know, we talked to the Soviet Union all throughout the Cold War, which is one reason why we didn't end up annihilating the planet. We've talked to China. We have big differences with China. You've got to talk to your enemies. That doesn't mean you capitulate. It's not a reward for good behavior. It's an instrument for solving problems and preventing miscalculation and misperception that can lead both parties into a war they don't want to have. So out of pure selfish U.S. national security interests, we should be in contact with those who we most are concerned about in order to try to resolve these problems.
That's an excellent note on which to end this. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Our guest today has been Jim Walsh, an expert in international security and a research associate with the Security Studies program at MIT. Thank you very much for watching.